computer. Okay, so admit all.
Instead of popping cans, they shoot it.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Desmond Gordon. I'm a member of Massillon Baptist Church and also a member of the Leonard D. Comether Institute. I will be your host tonight. Mr. Deacon Greg Owens will be your facilitator. My job is to mute you when you come on, not muted. So right now I'm seeing a lot of people that are unmuted. So I'm going to ask you if you all could mute yourselves at this point. But if you don't mute yourself, then I will mute you during the presentation. I just want to say thank you for joining us, and that is all you're going to hear from me. The next person you're going to hear from is Deacon Greg Owens at the appropriate time. Thank you all.
Thanks, Desmond. Good evening, good afternoon. We're going to wait just a few more minutes as people are still entering the waiting room, but not too long because we have a rich conversation and never enough time. So give us a few minutes and then we will get started.
Did you say?
I'm seeing someone else with the name Gregory Owens on here. So unless we got some doppelganger stuff going on, could you check and see who that other Gregory Owens is?
Sure, I'll take a look.
Thank you. I have 5:35 folks, so to honor those who are on the Zoom call now in a timely fashion and to expedite this, I'm going to get started. So good afternoon. Again, my name is Greg Owens, and it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. I see family members on, I see colleagues on, I see members of our church family. Thank you so much for taking time from busy schedules to be a part of this important conversation. Let me say off the top that we're going to be using the chat, and Des is going to help us kind of monitor that. So if you have questions, and we're in the midst of presenting, and I'll talk a bit more about how we're going to do that in a moment, please use the chat, and we'll try and get to all the questions that we can during the time that we have. So there are people still joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and they'll catch up with us in a moment. This is the 8th annual National Day of Racial Healing, a program that has been sponsored and supported by Kellogg Foundation. So I'm going to take just a moment and kind of walk us through a little bit of information that might be helpful. The theme of this year, and it's the hashtag also, which is used around the country, is how we heal. How we heal. And that's what we're going to be talking about with our panelists this afternoon and this evening. The basic tenets of the day, as Kellogg Foundation has informed us, are truth, racial healing, and transformation. And so when you go to the website and look up more about this, you'll see those basic pillars. I think the operating premise is, how do you get to the truth of the notions around racial healing? How do we engage in racial healing? And what does transformation look like once you engage in the change process and once you begin to get to the other side of some things around the pain and the disenfranchisement and the dehumanization of racism on these shores. And so this is an observance that occurs every year on the Tuesday following Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So it gives us an opportunity to not only appreciate the genius and the magnitude of Dr. King, but to follow up on that with a conversation about the things that were so important to him and that remain so important and germane to us in this day. We still continue to feel the effects of racism in its different forms. We are still harmed by it. We still need to understand how to heal, and we still need to understand the power of transformation. So this is sponsored by the Reverend Leonard D. Comathia Jr. Institute of the Macedonia Baptist Church. Our pastor is Reverend Michael Aaron Poindexter, and for the last 3 years, he has helped us begin to develop dreams. And then this year, we're taking our dreams and moving them into actionable items or making them a reality. Macedonia has been in the Albany community for more than 90 years and has this rich history of serving the community and being unafraid and unapologetic about taking on difficult issues and having serious conversations about things like racism and the other isms that plague us. And so it's always been a joy for myself and my wife, and our daughter is on also, to be a part of that Macedonia community, which is committed to not only dealing with how we operate within the four walls of our church, but how do we engage in healing and how do we come to a better understanding of who we are in this world outside of the four walls. So that leads me into the Institute, which was developed several years ago as a result of some of the vision work that our pastor of 35 years, or our pastor emeritus of 35 years, Reverend Leonard D. Comathia Jr., instilled in all of us who worked with him. And so that's our vision and that's our mission. And the Institute now is going to be operating within the context and confines of another entity that we've just developed so that our church can receive funds to do the important work that we do. but the Institute came out of the vision work of our pastor emeritus of 35 years, who continues to have, even in his retirement, a real close alignment with fairness and justice and what healing can look like. We've convened sessions on these topics, and again, very specifically and intentionally have focused on issues related to race and racism, and have invited people from the Macedonia community and outside to be a part of our conversation and join us in our work. So we come to our panel this evening, and why we've gathered this evening. And we've asked three people who I've had the pleasure of knowing over the course of, some of them 30 years and some of them only the last couple of years. But I'd like to introduce them to you and then have them introduce themselves in their own fashion. And then we'll jump into the questions we have for this evening. And again, I encourage you to, as you listen and learn, pose questions for us. And if we can't answer them, we'll certainly find a way to get answers as we move along, hopefully working with you. So David Brown is the CEO and president of the Capital District YMCA. Again, one of the largest employers in the Capital Region, with programs throughout the area that go from programs that focus on youth to opportunities for adults to engage in exercise. He is a part of so many boards. We don't really have the time to talk about them, but he has been fundamental in establishing the Capital District YMCA Black and Latino Achievers Program back in 2004. And the inaugural banquet was hosted by the late Coretta Scott King as the keynote speaker. And so that kicked off a very important program for our young people of color in the Capital Region. He's currently named to the Health Equity Work Group of the Centers for Disease Control. He lives in Guilderland with his wife and 4 children. Craig Allen is a 30-year friend of mine. We worked together at the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. Craig has an extensive background in youth justice, which is where I met him. And he ended up retiring from the state, developing an extensive portfolio of work within the child welfare, child protective system. Craig has his degree in organizational leadership and is currently working on a doctorate in the same field. And the newest colleague that I would share with you information about very briefly is Reverend Dr. Sherry Moloch. She and I met as a part of some work going on to deal with youth suicide, particularly Black youth suicide. And if you're doing any work in that area, you know the rates are rising, and it's unprecedented for a population where that was not necessarily a problem some decade ago or so. And so through the Haven Connects program, Dr. Moloch, Dr. Sidney Hankerson, and colleagues of theirs approached the Macedonia Baptist Church to be one of the churches to implement an upstream suicide prevention program for young people through the church community, working directly with them for several months to teach them the pillars of the program and how to engage in their own healing around suicide and suicide ideation, and also help to bring some adults aboard. So as we continue to try and implement the program as part of the ongoing work of the church, we have support from the adult population for young people. Reverend Dr. Moloch is a professor of psychology and a pastor emeritus, along with her husband, of church in the DMV area. We're really pleased to have all 3 of these presenters with us tonight. Heal Our Communities is the website that will help you understand more about this effort. It is spreading across the country. And my hope is that here, as a part of our conversation today, you'll pick up the gauntlet and do this work with greater intentionality as we continue to talk about how to transform, how to get to the other side of the pain and trauma of what racism has done in our lives. And healourcommunities.org will give you an example of what's going on around the country, skills to have these conversations, which are difficult conversations for many people, and how to grow the work right where you are. To find out more about Macedonia, macedoniaofalbany.org is the place to find out more about the church who is sponsoring this, and the church that is moving from dreams to reality. That said, I'd like to jump into our questions for this evening. And before I do that, let me ask if each one of the presenters, starting with Dave, would just briefly introduce yourselves beyond what I've said, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you, Deacon Owens, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening. Dave Brown, I'm the President and CEO, Capital District YMCA. I've been with the YMCA here in Albany for the past 30 years, but I've really grown up in the YMCA. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to have experiences with a very, very diverse group of people and communities. I reside here in Guilderland with my wife, who is a school teacher in the Albany City School District, and I have 4 children. One's grown and married and out of the house. My daughter is over at Siena College, and I have twin boys that are in college. One's at Xavier in Cincinnati, and the other is going to the University of Albany. And I have a lot of thoughts I'm hoping to share with you and look forward to the conversation. So thank you again for the invitation and opportunity to be here tonight.
Thanks so much, Dave. Craig, would you also briefly introduce yourself?
Well, good evening, everyone. As Greg said, he was my longtime supervisor and mentor in this work. Greg used to say he was grooming me to take his spot in OCFS. He left OCFS and then I retired, so c'est la vie. I am a native New Yorker. Lifelong, you'll notice the background actually used to be my view from my old neighborhood. But last year I moved down to Florida. And moving to Florida has given me some fresh perspective on just how far this conversation needs to be advanced, because it's a much different environment. I still work the conversation. So I have 2 adult daughters. One still lives in New York with the best grandson in the world. I'm making that statement now, and I will broke the argument about it. And the other one moved to Alabama a few years ago, where she now has a position as director of a daycare center. So looking forward to this conversation with some newly found colleagues in this work.
Thank you, Craig. And Sherry, if you would.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Deacon Greg, for the invitation, and to my colleagues who are on the panel with me. It's an honor to be here with you all to talk about this really important topic. As Deacon Greg said, I'm Sherry Davis Moloch. I'm an associate professor in clinical psychology at the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at George Washington University. And that's a mouthful, but I have to say all that so they'll be happy that I gave them credit for what I'm going to say. I'm bivocational. In addition to my work at George Washington University, I'm also the co-founding pastor emeritus of the Beloved Community Church, which is a church that's located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. My husband and I are the founding pastors of that church, and we recently retired from there after pastoring for 15 years this past May. I've been in ministry for 24 years in the DMV area. And my research, as Deacon Greg said, focuses on suicide prevention for African-American teens. And I've been doing that work for over almost 30 years, I think. And I also do HIV prevention programs for adolescents in Black churches as well. I teach in undergraduate and doctoral students in clinical psychology. So I train PhD students to do this work. And when we were preparing for this talk, I was lamenting with Craig and David that I teach a class of multicultural psychology. And for the first time in my 38-year career, I realized I can't teach that class in every school in the country. It would not be allowed in some states now. Oh, before we stop, I'm the proud mother of 3 young adult children, 33, 31, and 29. The proud Mimi of 2 beautiful daughters. I will give you credit for your grandson being wonderful because I have girls. So they are 10 and 6. And I'm also the proud mom of 2 furry babies, Flirt, who's 7, and Callie, who's 13. And you may, hopefully you won't hear them, but you might.
Well, Sheriff, if you got something to share with us, they're welcome to join us, absolutely. And so as you can see, our panelists all have a commitment to notions of fairness and justice and righteousness. they're family people, they have children, and they are rooted in this work from their own perspective and from the walk that they've taken both in their personal lives and their professional lives. And so as we begin to think about this conversation, I want to just plant some seeds and have you who have joined us this evening begin to think about this also. There are different levels of racism that we have to contend with. They go from the individual or interpersonal. They move through the intrapersonal. They move into the institutional or systemic realm. And then they move into what's called the structural realm, which is sometimes connected to the systemic realm. So the question that I'd ask you to think about as we begin this conversation by looking at the questions we prepared is where do you think racism in its 4 or more levels, because some people identify the cultural racism as another dimension of that, or when you think about notions of genocide, that maybe is more culturally relevant. Where do you think it's really had the most impact on you in your life? Where do you think you've had an intersection with it in your life? At which of those levels? And that's something that I just ask you to kind of percolate with, because we may come back to that before we leave this conversation this evening. So I'm going to jump into the first of our 5 prepared questions. Again, we'd ask you to think about what you'd like to add to this. I see someone has put something in the chat, and we'll certainly check on that. But the first question that I'm going to ask our panelists to begin to talk a bit about is, how does racism impact the lives of Black people, Latinos, and Latinx, people from the tribal or indigenous community? How does it impact them, us, in our lives in America today? And either of you 3 can start this.
Well, if I can start, like, one of the things that I saw in Florida actually happened shortly after I moved here. As I said, I moved here late April, early May 2023. And the governor, one of the first things he did, or one of the things he did since I've been down here, is to eliminate the AP African American Black Studies courses in high school. So you can't do that anymore. And then he eliminated all funding for all DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion programs, on all college campuses here, on college campuses and various school districts, and any state organizations throughout all of Florida. So he eliminated all the funding and any positions attached to that funding. So if you had a DEI director or commissioner, that position was eliminated and it's no longer an issue. In his own words, Florida is where woke came to die. Now, I think of being awake as a good thing, but apparently down here it's not a good thing. So if we're not awake, I don't know, does that mean we're still sleeping? I don't know. But there's if that is a position that is being taken by the head of the state, then a lot of dominoes fall behind that help impact the lives of people of color here. And other states are looking at what's happening here, or the governors, and seeing how they can follow suit where they are. This we know.
Thanks, Craig. David?
Yeah, I think I think it has a tremendous impact on people. The trauma that people suffer from, because what we say and what we do matters. And I was fortunate when I was growing up. My family, when I was small, we moved into a neighborhood, and it was pretty traditional, all white community. And as Black people started moving in, all the other folks started moving out. But there was one neighbor that I remember. It was a family. It was an Asian family, The family was, you know, their heritage was from China, and I remember how much pride they had in Bruce Lee. And I went to a Bruce Lee movie with them, and they talked to me about Bruce Lee the same way Black folks would talk about Jackie Robinson or Dr. King. But one of the things I didn't realize at the time was how much hurt they had felt in their assimilation to this country, and what that caused for them to feel certain levels of anger and what they wanted to accomplish. And so kind of seeing that in another culture growing up, when I was pretty much grew up in a predominantly Black community, and understanding what was happening with people of color, it made me realize that racism impacts all of us, doesn't matter what background we're from, there's some effect that happens to us. And so what people say and what we do, it causes a certain amount of trauma. And the studies show that in some races, there's a high incidence of suicide or attempted suicide because of the scars that have been left from racism. So it's not something that we can shrug our shoulders at. And I think having conversations like this one we're taking part of tonight is really a big step in the healing process. I really believe that we're at a time in this world that sitting down and talking with one another and being honest and having authentic conversations is how we heal from these things. Silence is not going to create the healing that we need.
Yeah, I would agree with Craig and David. I think that although we tend to focus more, particularly in the media, on individual acts of prejudice and racism, what I think is much more damaging is systemic. You can literally, the way that racial trauma becomes intergenerational is because it's systemic. And I think the most recent example of that was how the COVID-19 pandemic differentially impacted communities of color. So when the pandemic first started, most of my colleagues who do public health work, physicians, people who are in medical field, mental health field, as soon as that started, and within a couple of months, we all began to get extremely worried about that. We already knew before any data came in that it was going to disproportionately affect people of color. And the reason for that is because of systemic racism. So you have systemic racism, as we've all been saying, is when you have systems that interact with each other to oppress people. And the easiest and the most efficient way to do that is segregate housing. If you can segregate where people live, you can affect their health care, you can affect their ability to get groceries, you can affect their school system, you can affect their access to things. And so the trickle down effect from that, where people from COVID, it wasn't just simply, for example, isolating at home, because more people from communities of color are more likely to have jobs where they can't isolate at home. They may have service industry was really hit hard by COVID. And guess who is more likely to be employed by service industry? People from communities of color. Who is more likely to have less access to care? Communities of color. Even the way they distributed the vaccines initially, in our area, you had to have a car to get to the vaccine. And so we kept saying, well, what about the people who don't have a car? What about the people who live in the city and there's no transportation? We went to this is a true story, an outlet for used furniture. It was a used furniture outlet place. That's where we got our first COVID vaccine. I couldn't even find a vaccine for my 95-year-old dad. And I was calling Walgreens, CVS, because of where he lived. And we finally were able to do that, but the effort for people of color to get immunized was much more challenging. People who live in communities of color are more likely to live in multi-generational families. So that means the virus is more likely to spread in your family. So it wasn't surprising to us that people had more cases of COVID in communities of color and people died more frequently. And those of us in the faith community, I did more funerals during COVID, my husband and myself, than we did our entire career in ministry. So when people look at individual things like someone won't sell you cookies, that is harmful and it could contribute to racial trauma, but what's much more difficult to combat are these systems.
Thank you, Sherry. And that's an excellent springboard for our next question, which was we were going to ask each of you to talk about where it's most salient and relevant for you. And you began that by talking about the notion of it being systemic and no structural. And certainly giving examples of that are really critically important. Talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll ask Craig to talk some about that too, because having a perspective of having worked in a state system for 3 decades gives some of us who did that an interesting inside look at how that operates. So, Sheriff, if you could say some more about that and the systemic nature of it, then I'll segue into Craig and ask him to weigh in on that a bit.
Well, I think one of the other ways I see this, and this might be true for probably David and Craig as well, is mental health care system. When I look at just access to care, who is considered to be a provider of care, part of that is, I think, because we internalize racism too. Black folks are less likely to trust mental health professionals and are more likely to use more informal helpers, which is not a bad thing to use informal helpers, but sometimes it takes a village. And so what happens is we tend to cut ourselves off from access to these other systems of care. We also tend to not get treated well in these systems of care. So one of the things I ask when I do workshops for systems of care, Deacon Greg, is I ask them, what is it like for someone to enter their system? Are you going, most people who are poor and from communities of color get their mental health treatment in the emergency room. That's not a good system of care for mental health. The largest provider of mental health services is the prison industrial complex. That is also not a good place to get mental health care. What I'm saying to you is those systems are not designed to give good mental health care because they don't have good follow-up systems. People who are in the emergency room, their job is to get you in, get you access quickly, and get you back out. That's their job. They can't handle the volume of people. There's no follow-up care in that, unless you build systems that can do that. So for me, what's very frustrating is when things like COVID-19 happen, or when we have a hurricane in the community, I already know that the system is not designed for people of color to get help in the systems. And so, I think all of those of us who work in this area, we're tired of being sick and tired of seeing the same scenario play out over and over again, because we're not fixing the system. I did a workshop on this a couple of years ago, and what I called it was Learning to Swim in Shark-Infested Waters. And I basically said, we all know the nature of sharks, so we shouldn't be surprised if we have blood in the water that sharks have a feeding frenzy, but we act like sharks are porpoises and seals. They're not. And so this is work that's ongoing work. It's important. I love what David and Craig said earlier about the healing. It's important that you nurture yourself and replenish yourself, because it's not like a one and done deal with this work. This work is ongoing, and you can't get weary and well doing. So you got to take care of yourself, got to take breaks. During the COVID pandemic, my husband and I literally, we call them media blockouts. So we would just not watch the news for a couple of days, because for us, particularly as pastors, it's overwhelming watching the numbers of deaths climb, hearing people call us, can we pray for loved ones? Can we find a vaccine for someone? So we became social workers, doctors, garbage collectors. We wear a lot of different hats. And another thing I should have mentioned, and I'll stop, clergy were extremely stressed out. I had colleagues who were trying to self-medicate during this because it was so stressful for them. And nobody was really paying attention to the impact on clergy, on faith leaders.
You're muted, Greg.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Appreciate that. Craig, let me ask you to weigh in on some of that too, and then we'll ask David.
Well, I started working for what was then the Division for Youth in 1987, working in a juvenile detention facility in Brooklyn, New York. At that time, New York State had some 3,000 young people in its system. The facility I worked at, we maxed out, I think, at around 65 youth there at any given time. During my 7-year tenure in that facility, I believe I encountered 2 white youth and 1 Asian youth. And I remember asking, before I even understood this work, I remember asking back then, I know there are, and this may sound crazy, please just forgive me, it may not sound politically correct. I was like, I know there are white kids in this state that are committing crime. Why are they not here? And a part of the reason was, frankly, back then, that a lot of the youth that I dealt with were being placed with us for selling crack, and there was a much lower threshold in terms of volume for crack versus powdered cocaine. And as crack was sold mostly in the inner city and neighborhoods of color, and powdered cocaine was a lot sold in the suburbs of upstate New York, it was easier to put them to lock up the children of color than their white counterparts of upstate New York. But then the other thing that happened over the years was it became almost normalized in the systems to see Black and brown children locked up. To see, and what I found odd and kind of hurtful was I remember staff members that some of my colleagues, kind of reinforcing the behavior with the kids, that where you are is where you're going to be, and you'll never be much of anything else than that. And a part of that was they had seen it for so long and felt helpless to change the cycle. They kind of surrendered to it themselves. And the staff that I found that were able to kind of break that cycle with them were the staff that worked in youth in a positive way on the outside and did not see all youth as this is kind of inevitable, but began to work with them in a different way. And so there was some hope for these youth. Now, moving forward, some 25 years later, I actually remember attending a meeting with Greg Owens, Dickie Greg Owens, at a court in New York City that met with judges. And they wanted to address the fact that they were seeing so much disparity in their racial outcomes for youth placed in foster care and family courts. And the oddest thing to me was that the judges called Greg to facilitate this meeting. But in family court, it's the judge. Family court, there is no jury. The judges are the ones who make the decisions on the placement of the youth or the families, the decisions for the families. And the judges admitted in this meeting that they placed harsher sentences and harder decisions on families of color than, they would do a harsher decision on a Hispanic family than an Asian family, on a Black family than a white family. And the judges sat there and admitted this, and the conversation was, well, then why don't you change it? And they got stuck in the process. So the fact that we were having this observation some 25, 30 years apart from each other, to me, says that even when people acknowledge that there is work to be done, they don't know how to advance the work. And it is up to individuals and groups of individuals to work with them to say, knowing this problem is not enough. It's what do we do to erase the problem? What do we do to address the problem? Otherwise, we become cooperators with the problem, and we reinforce the problem and perpetuate it for future generations.
Okay, I'll get rid of it. Hold on.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you. So, and I remember that meeting. It was long before I had all this gray hair, and the work may have caused this gray hair. But I think that before I ask Dave to respond, there's 2 gaps we always talk about when trying to address this work. The first gap is to close the gap between not knowing and knowing. The second gap is to close the gap between knowing and doing. And that's where people get stuck. And so it takes fortitude, it takes courage, it takes persistence, it takes a certain level of risk taking to move from now I know to, uh-oh, now I have to do something. So that's where individuals within a system continue to perpetuate systemic kinds of things, in my humble opinion. But Dave, let's hear from you.
Yeah, so much is being said here, and I like to respond to a lot of it, but I'm gonna try to hone mine in a little bit of a different area, and it's around opportunity, and our folks are not being given opportunity. Racism comes down to power and policy. So when you have the power and you're controlling the policy, you are able to keep people out. And one of the biggest things that folks are being kept out of is to be in decision-making chairs. When I was growing, I grew up in New Jersey, and I was fortunate. My next door neighbor was African-American male by the name of Ron Sargent. He was the president of the YMCA. And at the time, he was one of 5 African-Americans in the country to be the president of the YMCA. It was a big deal in the YMCA movement. I didn't know what he did, and I certainly didn't know I was going to be the president of Y. But today we have 40 African-Americans that are presidents of YMCAs. Here's the problem. There's 750 YMCAs across the country.
Wow.
So people are not getting an opportunity to be in some of these seats. And while we're making progress, there's a lot of people, not only in YMCAs, but in the NFL, in Major League Baseball, in Microsoft, so on and so forth. They're unable to get to positions of decision-making and power. There's a number of corporate boards. Greg, in your introduction, you talked about how many boards I'm on. Well, a lot of the boards that I'm on, you'd be shocked at the process that they use to select people. And oftentimes, our folks are not considered for a number of reasons that don't make any sense at all. We see people get jobs because they have the same last name as someone else. So the nepotism that takes place. So I think one of the biggest things that's really impacting our folks in the systemic racism is simply the opportunity to have some of these well-paying jobs. Because, if you can keep people poor and frustrated, that cycle, the statistics show us that cycle repeats itself. The other thing that is really troubling to me and that I have tremendous concern about is our education system. We see a school on one block and it looks like it just went through a war. And less than 5 miles down the street, we see another school that looks like paradise. Why are we so different? And we look at kids dropping out of these schools that are under-resourced and they're underserved, but we don't always look at what's happening in the system to these children. They go home, they don't have food, they're sharing a bedroom and their clothes with other siblings. Why would I be worried about my grades if I don't have heat in my house, or I don't have food on the table, or if I don't have good lighting? And the system doesn't address these things. And typically the folks that are impacted are in the marginalized community, people of color. So I think those are the biggest things that are taking place in systemic racism today, that are creating a vicious cycle, that are really impacting us and causing generational trauma, because these children are hurt, they're angry, and it's not healthy for them, and they're looking for someone to validate their experience. They're looking for someone to share their feelings with and to help them with these feelings. And this is why I believe we see so much hurt and despair on folks from these communities.
I often get asked, why is the suicide rate going up so much with young Black kids? And I think you hit it on the head, David. When I was saying that racism is like sharks, I mean that literally. Sharks are very adaptable, and they're like centuries old, and you can't wipe them out, because they're really good at adapting to their environment, and that's how racism is. And so we're looking, sometimes people, and we're all around the same age probably, we have to realize that our kids are exposed to racism in different ways. For example, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat. So our kids are exposed to things instantaneously in ways that we were not. A lot of us, I know I grew up in a middle class environment, but it was predominantly Black. So in many places around the country, if you're in a middle class community, you're one of a few. And I would, one of the things I love about living in the DMV area, it is a place where you can live in a predominantly Black community and also live in a middle class community. I think the quality of the education, David, you're absolutely right. The difference in resources is unimaginable. My youngest daughter went to a Catholic high school. And when she went to college, she thought college was easier than high school. She did very well. Her educational experience and some of the educational experience of her peers was like night and day. The kids were not prepared for college, and that's not their fault. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have computers, they didn't have access to Wi-Fi in their community. If they were going to use a computer, they had to go to the library, and if you've ever used a computer in the library, you have 30 minutes to sit and then you have to move. Now, I don't know about you all, I know the assignments that I assign students at the college level, it takes longer than 30 minutes. And the assumption in high schools and probably middle schools now is that kids have access to a computer.
Mm-hmm.
So the differences in resources alone, these children get further and further behind. So by the time they go to college, even with good grades, they are not prepared for college curriculum. They're not. I have students in my class who cannot write. They're smart, but they don't know how to express themselves in writing. And I spend a lot of time on that. And that means I'm not spending time on something else. So I think those inequities really have to be addressed. And it's really important to recognize that, because that has to be fixed. We can focus on lots of things that are not that important in the long run and avoid these systemic things because it's harder to deal with them. But if we don't fix housing, if we don't fix making sure people have a livable earning wage, if we don't fix access to education, access to healthcare, all the other stuff doesn't really matter. With my suicide prevention program, I said if we have stable housing, guaranteed living wage, if we could have access to good educational quality of education and healthcare, the suicide rates would plummet, because those are the basic needs that people have that are not addressed and are not met.
Thank you, all three of you, for those cogent responses. I'm going to invite people who are with us this evening to go to the chat and just answer this quick question for us, okay? When did race become most salient or relevant to you in your life? How young were you? How old were you? When did race become most salient or relevant to you? And just give us an age in the chat box, if you would. Just take a moment if you do that. How old were you? Thank you. Thank you. You see some responses coming in. Thank you.
Oh man, I forgot.
Thank you, folks. We'll wait just for a few more. So we have quite a few that were very young, 4, 5, 6, fourth grade. And then we have some a little bit later on. And we have a few where race became salient later on in life. And if I was going to
Brother Owens, I'm sorry, I think some of the answers came directly to you, some came directly to me. So
okay.
you have ages like age 18 when I went away to a predominantly white college, age
Hmm.
11, age 12, around
Hmm.
8 years old, 4 years old. Neighbor called police on me and my brother because we were standing on her sidewalk.
Hmm.
5 years old, 10 years
Hmm.
old. I believe I was about 10.
Thank you, Desmond. So if you look at some of the literature on bias, you'll find that bias begins to kick in around 6 years of age, is some of the reports that I've read, some of the studies that I've read. And real quickly, I think, again, if you explore some of the research around some of these issues, Dave, you said I'd be surprised how people end up on these boards. Maybe, but then there's, again, bias. There's a reason why CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are all over 6 feet tall, or most of them, an inordinate amount of them. We've made some sort of calculus, if you will, between height and competence or intelligence or something like that. So our narrative drives our decision making, and that's where you talked about the power being kind of prevalent. So thank you all for participating in that quick poll. I think we lost Craig. Craig, are you with us, or? Okay, we'll wait till he comes back on. I think he tried to get back in, and he'll hopefully rejoin us. All right, so the next question that I'd ask our panelists to begin to talk a bit about, and Dave, we'll start with you. Can you think of any specific strategies that you believe can help reduce the harm and help people heal from the impact of racism?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think doing what we're doing tonight is a great way, for us to heal from this. My faith is strong, and Deacon, my involvement with the churches here locally, and so being a man of faith, I would always encourage people to have that spiritual relationship with God. Mine happens to be with Jesus, but whoever it is for others, that how they choose to worship and support in the church. But outside of the church, I think it's important for us to get folks together, and not always getting everybody together that agrees with us. Having conversations with people who do not look like us, who come from different cultures, and to talk about, how we feel. I mentioned that one of my neighbors growing up for a short period of time was a Chinese family, and I listened to how much pride they had in their Asian heritage. Another family that was down the street, they were Jewish, and so I listened to their pride around being Jewish. But without even realizing it, I was learning about their culture. I was learning about what was important to them, and I think they were learning about me as well as an African American. And playing sports, meeting so many different people from different backgrounds, you learned about each other, and you learned how to get along, and you learn to appreciate folks and say, hey, no, he's not quite like that. He's an all right guy. Those kinds of things. So I think the biggest part of healing is to not be silent, to sit and be authentic and develop trust with one another. Those are some of the things that I think have to happen immediately. But most importantly, I think it's important for individuals, if we're talking one-on-one, to find someone they could sit down with and say, "Hey, I'm feeling some kind of way." I don't, like in my circle of professional colleagues in the YMCA, there's a number of us that will call each other and we'll say, "Hey, you won't believe what happened to me today," and then they'll say back to me, "Dave, the same thing happened to me," and I'm like, "Wow, I thought I was the only one." So getting affirmation that these things aren't only happening to you, and getting advice from others on how to deal with it, and also giving people, I think those are some of the main strategies. Faith, friends, talking about it, sharing, building trust, being authentic.
That's good, Dave. Thank you for that. Sherry?
I agree with, I'm just gonna say ditto whatever Dave said. So I think if I were to sum up what he was saying, we need to be in affirming spaces. And we need to be in places where we feel socially connected to somebody. And we need to be in a place where we feel like we matter. Social connectedness is really important. It's basically a protective factor for almost any mental health challenge you have. And the thing I want everyone to hear tonight is these are things you can already do. And these are things that you already have access to, and it doesn't cost money. One of the best places I think to go is faith communities. Obviously, I'm a former pastor of a church, and I think faith is important. But what faith communities do really well is they keep you socially connected, and they make you feel like you affirm you. You can do this in so many different ways. I know my mom was one of 14 children. And once a month, her sisters, it was 6 sisters, they would get together and play Pokino. And you would have thought there was thousands of dollars on that table the way they played. They were so competitive. But they just did it to get together. It wasn't the money and the pennies didn't really matter. It was to get together. You can do this through Greek organizations. You can do this through other cultural organizations. You can do this through friendships. I have good female friends who are in ministries because, believe it or not, we still have a lot of prejudice against female women in ministry. And so it's good for me to get, like Dave said, to get with them and say, oh, such and such a thing happened. Because sometimes you feel so isolated, you begin to question your own sanity. You're thinking, am I making this up? And that's one of the hard things about microaggressions, which we've all experienced, is that it's little stuff that people can easily deny was racist. And so you go home wondering, well, maybe I am, when people accuse you of being overly sensitive, well, maybe I am imagining this. So I think that's really important. I also think it's important, and I said this before, take a break. It's really that saying when you get on the airline, put your mask on first. If you don't replenish yourself, and even those of us in the faith community, even Jesus went off by himself sometimes and rested after he had a major event in his ministry. So everybody needs to take a break and take care of yourself and do something that you love and enjoy just for the sake of it. And you don't have to explain to people why you're taking a break or justify it. You're taking a break because you need a break. That's it. One of the things I'm really working on is learning how to say no.
And Rev, if I can, Deacon, if I could just piggyback on something that she just said, that and I so appreciate you saying that, because I think one of the things that happens to us because of racism, we don't not only take a break, we try to run harder because we feel like, oh man, I've got to run faster, I've got to be better, and if I don't, all of this, it's at risk right now. I'm jeopardizing, what I have. They're gonna kick me out, or they're gonna do this to me, or they're not gonna treat me fair. They're gonna do me wrong, and that constant feeling, and that's why we're seeing so many men of color, high blood pressure, heart attack, dying in early age. I mean, the impact of racism literally takes years off of our lives, because we won't stop until something actually stops us because of the impact of the system on us. So I just wanted to say, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's probably been one of the hardest things for me to take a step back. And I would share with this group, I had to take a step back because I went to go see my doctor, and he said, none of these numbers look any good. So you got to do something about this and take better care of yourself.
Thank you so much, Dave. That's real. And it's part of culture, unfortunately, to try and convince us to work until we drop. That's historic narrative for us since we hit these shores. And so when my
husband and I retired from the church, you should have heard all the negative feedback we got from other pastors who told us we were too young to retire. I'll be 67 in 2 weeks. I'm like, no, I'm not. Okay. Other people get to retire in their 50s and 60s. And it was amazing to me. And I have family members who are still mad with me and saying, I have deserted the church. I have deserted my post.
That's an unfortunate narrative for us to walk around with. And that's why we have to have these conversations. And before we leave this, this evening, I'll kind of share some of the work we're doing in healing that might resonate for you, because I think Dr. Sean Ginwright's work in healing, strength, and engagement really could save us. So I'll share that with you before we get off. But Craig, so good to have you back.
Thank you, sir.
And the question that we were asking Sherry and David, and they certainly aptly responded to, is one that I'll ask you to take a moment and respond to, which is, what are some specific strategies you believe can help reduce the harm and help people heal from the effects or impact of racism?
Well, you know, one of the things that actually you helped introduce us to at OCFS was some learning exchanges, racial equity learning exchanges, which was opportunities for people to get together and have some facilitated conversations around some very challenging issues. Not from an expert to novice posture, but from a what can we all gain from this? We're all kind of impacted by this. And one of the things that I think I kind of came in on the tail end of hearing Dr. Sherry talk about how important it is to rest. David talking about your own doctor said, and yeah, Greg, you're right. We have that. We have been taught well, even from childhood, that you know when you're Black, you have to be better, stronger, faster. You don't get to take time off like other people do, and it's odd. But I think that to help heal from this, you have to be willing to sit with some people and admit there's a problem, and really talk about what we can do so that, as I heard Sherry say, so that we don't think that we're crazy. Because that, you know, I've been in rooms with people and it's like, did I really just hear what I thought I heard? Did I really just see what I thought I saw? I mean, something as simple as, you know, and this actually happened to me 2 weeks ago in church, where after this, you know, I've been visiting the church down here when the service was over. I went over and it's a very large church, and I was speaking to the pastor. And he and I were talking about just some things, or to the person who spoke, and we just got into this really great conversation, or we're beginning to have a conversation. And in the middle of our conversation, some people just came in and decided that whatever they had to say was more important than what we were talking about, and really tried to interrupt us. And thankfully, the pastor was able to kind of shut that down. But I was kind of like, I'm kind of a big guy, kind of hard to miss. Did you not see? You know, did you not see me here? So we're seeing that even though we're in this time, there are times that we can be invisible. We can be voiceless. What we think, feel, believe, see, irrelevant. Don't pay attention to it. And I think that's important to have these kind of conversations so that we do. And I like what you said, Sherry, that every now and then you have to disengage. As you said, Jesus took some time with all he was doing to get away from everybody and find some time to rest and refresh and then re-engage. Rest, refresh, and then re-engage. Because when we are burned out and when we are stressed out and we are overworked and overburdened, we become no good, and actually we become toxic to people and toxic to systems. And we begin to take our frustrations out on the people that are closest to us. So it's imperative that we monitor our own physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, financial health, so we're able to do the things that we need to do in this life.
I think that's so important. And what I'm going to say is probably not going to be popular, but I'm going to say it anyway because I'm going to say it. The model of success for men in this country is particularly toxic for Black men. And it was designed to be that way. And so part of the work for Black men has to be, and Black women, has to be to change the expectations and what it looks like to be a successful Black man. I was teaching a class at Howard University School of Divinity, and I asked them, it's mostly men in the class, and I asked them, what makes a man successful? So I wrote down everything they said. And then I said, which one of these is easy to do? Let's pick one. And none of them were easy. And I said, why is that? And they were like, I said, it's designed for you not to succeed in it. It's designed that way. And I think part of what we have to recognize, again, when I said earlier, a shark is a shark. Sharks behave like sharks. Racism behaves like racism. So you can't be naive about that. And I'm not saying we don't combat that, but we were talking on the pre-call here about this notion of resilience. Resilience is really important, but resilience can be a setup, because why don't we change the environment so you don't have to be resilient? You know what I'm saying? It's like there's an image that we use with resiliency research where there's dandelions that are busting through concrete. And that's the model of resilience, because weeds can grow. And if you have a garden or have a yard or a sidewalk, you know, weeds can grow through anything. And that's interesting, except what David said earlier. What did his doctor say to him? So while you're being a weed, you're also killing yourself. You're going to early grade. Black men have the lowest life expectancy, except for Native American men, in the country. There's a reason for that. And so I think if we're naive in thinking these are accidental findings, they're not accidental findings. These are done by design. And recognizing that and owning that is the first step to healing. And then deciding you can't necessarily change all of that. You can change your response to it. You always have control over how you respond to something. And then pick some other markers for success.
I think you know, I was telling some people this earlier, and I think Greg, you can appreciate this. When I first started working in the juvenile justice field, I was in my mid-20s. I was very young. It was my first real job. And, you know, in my head, it was like, I'm gonna go work with these young men. And after spending some time with me, they're going to realize the error of their ways. They're going to turn around from this. They're going to embrace education. They're going to become upstanding members of this community, and they're going to give up a life of crime. And you know, they were just going to become bastions of stability and role models wherever they go, right? That idea lasted about 2.5 days when I started working in that facility. And suddenly success for me had to really be redefined, right? So now success became, if I can get this young man to wear his pants at the right level, above his waist with the belt, if I can get him to stop using the N-word, if I can get him to say please and thank you and stop cursing so frequently, if we can get him to sit in class and not disrupt the class, then move on to actually participating in class, that became successful. But that process may take months. And it was not insignificant, but it took some radical readjusting on my part to understand what was doable there, so I did not wind up burning myself out trying to achieve something that was unachievable.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig.
But you know, Deacon, I think one of the challenges that we have is that things have changed so much in our community. There's a commercial, it's a car commercial. I think it's a car commercial. It's a family driving, it's a Black woman, and she looks back in the back seat and she says to the kids, they're playing, and she says, "Don't make me come back there." And then in the next scene, she's in the back of the car playing with them, right? When I was growing up, if my mother said, "Don't make me come back there," and you didn't stop, she pulled the car over. And then you're saying, "Oh, she can't reach me." She'd open up the glove compartment and pull out a belt. And you're like, "Oh," and you stop, you know, and that was that. We've lost some of that. No, we've lost all of that. And those are some of the things that I think are impacting us in helping bring children up the right way. I know that there's all these arguments about what's child abuse and this and this and that, but my point is that discipline, respect, and some of these things, we're not consistently sharing those things in our family values. And these are some things that we have to really start looking at and talk, and not being afraid to talk about, and I think we underestimate how much we actually talk about the impact and the effects of racism. I think we think that by us role modeling our culture and our households, and that our kids aren't being impacted by it. I know numerous kids of color who growing up in suburban communities who don't identify with an African culture. They have a very European culture and belief, and particularly our young girls. They struggle with who do they date when everyone they look at doesn't look like them. There's just so many variables that are taking place that I think that we have to talk about in terms of our families and keeping our culture and our families together.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, all three of you, for your responses. Let me drop a couple of resources on us here as we kind of move towards the last portion of this, and then ask the last question that I'd asked the three of you to respond to. And then what I'd like to do is open that up for people to respond to either in the chat or otherwise, right? So the resources, there's a book by one of our geniuses in this work, Dr. Ivory Tolson. And what Dr. Tolson has written is a book called No BS. And he means no bad statistics. Dr. Tolson is a genius with data and has helped me to understand that much of the information that we use back when I was doing work for the state, and even before that, stories about, 1 out of 3 of you young people are going to end up back in the system. Stories about about Black people ending up in prison more than they go to college. Those were not supported by data, but they were the narrative that we were selling to our young people that we thought was going to incline them to be better than. And what it did was take away hope for many of them. What it did was tell them a story about something that they felt they had no agency over, and therefore they gave up. And it was bad data. So what Dr. Tolson is asking us to do is to stop taking that as if it's good data and begin to do our own work to find out what's real and what's true. And then we can teach that to children and youth and families. So Dr. Ivory Tolson, No BS, No Bad Data. And then The Invisible Ache by Courtney Vance and Dr. Robin Smith, which speaks to mental health and suicide in our community. As many of you may know, Courtney's father took his life while Courtney was performing. I think it was on Broadway. And so he tells the story of how he dealt with that and how we are kept from completely healing and being whole by the stereotypes and the prejudices and the narrative that has been perpetuated in our communities through various institutions in our community. And so I'd invite you to pick that book up and begin to read that so we can have some further conversation about these kinds of issues. So as we begin to wind down, the last question, and I must tell you folks who are joining us this evening, this excited our presenters here, right? When I said, and I'm going to ask them now, because you had a couple of days to think about this. So I know it's like you studied for the quiz, so now you're ready to take the quiz. But I asked you to think about what this country would look like if we were actually able to eradicate racism. What would this country look like if we were actually able to eradicate, to get rid of racism? And so I'm going to ask each one of you to take just a couple of minutes and respond to that. And while I'm doing that, I'd ask those who are on the call with us this evening to think about that. And I'm going to open it up after our panelists present to ask you to respond in the chat box or perhaps even come off mic. So let me start with Craig. What would this country look like if we could eradicate racism?
I think there would be more equitable distribution of resources. For example, there will be no more food deserts in community, right? No more neighborhoods where, as happens in so many neighborhoods of color, where there is no more, you can't find a decent supermarket or quality food. I think the schools would all have similar resources, quality of books, quality of computers, quality of musical instruments, quality of athletic equipment. And this may sound odd, but there would be no more need for a Black History Month or a Hispanic History Month or a Women's History Month, because all of those would be included, all of those stories would be woven into the narrative of what makes up this country and the world and the impact they have on the world throughout the year. So there's no need to say we're going to focus on this month, because we already focus on it for the rest of the year. And even now, it's like, you know, yesterday, today, we see this weekend, we heard a lot of stuff about Dr. Martin Luther King, including some videos I've never seen, awards I've never heard, everything else. But we don't hear a lot about Dr. King in July. And I think that a part of that would be, we would be able to have respect for all the different cultures, and it would be kind of woven into the fabric of everything we do. So we would not have to lift one up for one particular month opposed to all the other ones.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you. Sherry, I'm going to jump to you.
I'm going to go to church for a second. I think it would be the fulfillment of the Lord's Prayer. So thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I think heaven and earth would be indistinguishable. I also think that the United States has a responsibility to be the leaders and to be that beacon of light on the hill that's in Isaiah, and to be that community that stands in the gap. And I think if we would truly live into who we say we are but have never been. And I think we would also be an example to other communities around the world of what it would look like to have justice. There would be no cult of personality in politics. There would be no inequities in health, finances, economics, mental health, education. And I really agree with what Craig said about there would be no need for special days because all people would be affirmed. And so you wouldn't need to have a special day or a special month.
Thank you, Sherry. Dave, if you would give us a couple of your reflections on that, assuming
Well,
yeah,
I'm going to agree with Reverend that I think it would look like what God intended the world to look like, and I think we wouldn't have homelessness, and I think we wouldn't have hunger, and I think we'd have equitable education systems, and I agree with Brother Craig that we wouldn't have a need for some of these other things. We'd all be operate as one. But since we are just one day removed from Dr. King's birthday, let me kind of maybe put it in, more, I guess, earthly terms. If we look at his I Have a Dream speech and the things that he talked about and the world that he envisioned in that speech, I think if racism was eradicated, it would look very much like the vision that Dr. King painted for us on that memorable day. But sadly, if you even look at the opening lines of his speech and the transcript of his speech, some of the things the ugliness that he was addressing in Alabama, that the governor was spewing at that time, many of those things are still in existence today. And I submit to you that in some ways may be worse than it was during that time, because at least then they told you straight up how they felt about you. Today we have so many covert operations and systemic things that are taking place. It's hugely challenging. So I think that the world would look like what Dr. King was trying to paint for us to see.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, all three of you. I think that's part of the healing framework. And so while I ask the folks who are on the call with us to kind of think about what you think it would look like if we could completely eradicate racism, let me share the framework that we're working with in different places around what it looks like to center healing. It's called healing-centered engagement. And in essence, we offer a framework that has 5 components to it. The first is culture, because almost everything is culture. But it's the deeper part of culture where we find our most significant biases, and that's the areas that we stay away from in terms of having these conversations. So it's not just what we smell and taste and see and touch. It's the deeper issues around beliefs and traditions and taboos that we really need to begin to explore in terms of culture. There's this notion of agency, which Sherry talked about, that we do have a lot more control than we think, but we have to really understand what our agency is. And so how do we work on building agency and not be overwhelmed by the size of the problem? The third portion of this is relationships. And we talked about that early on too. And the science says the more relationships you have, the better off you're going to be. And so that's particularly important for young people, and particularly important during COVID, when they lost the opportunity to engage in a lot of the networks that they were able to engage in within the educational settings, in the community, at the various organizations, the YMCAs, all that shut down, broke into that network. And that's part of the stress that young people were experiencing and that many of us were experiencing. So relationships. The fourth part of that is meaning. So the purpose. Why am I here in the first place? What am I supposed to be doing while I'm here? Something that we don't pay a lot of attention to. We don't talk out loud about, unless perhaps it is within the context of our church and our faith walk. But the question of what we're here for really deserves a lot of attention. And then the last one is aspirations, because sometimes we give up on dreaming, because we're too busy to dream, because people don't value our dreams, because we don't have the language to talk about our dreams. And so that framework of CARMA, karma, is what Dr. Ginwright promotes through the Flourish Agenda. And I encourage you to explore that as we try and do this work of racial healing. Finally, he talks about 4 pivots. He says to pivot from the lens of looking outwards to the process of working on the mirror, looking inward first. And those of us who are in the social work profession, that's antithetical to what we were taught. We were taught to start with the other. I see my colleague and friend from grad school, Annette Murray, on the call. That's what we were taught at the University of Pennsylvania. Start with the other. Dr. Jim Knight says, if you do that, you never do the mirror work that lets you know who you are. And so switching that is a way to engage in this process. And then moving from transactional relationships, which is a business enterprise relationship, into transformative ones, where real caring and transformation can occur. And that takes a lot of vulnerability and transparency that we're really not very good at. And he says to move from focusing on the problem, which is unfortunately what we're rewarded for in most of our institutions, to be great problem solvers, to focus on possibilities. And as a matter of fact, to focus on possibilities before you try and solve the problem. And the fourth one is when we talked about early on here, is to move from the frenzy and the false notion that being busy makes us matter more into the flow, they call it, or finding time to rest, which takes us back to culture, my friends, because not every culture distances himself from the need to rest. They look different than our culture, and so sometimes we laugh at them, right? Movies have people taking siestas, and we said, oh, look at those lazy people. maybe they knew something and know something that we don't know about how to extend life and have more meaningful lives by finding time to rest. So I would just plant those seeds. We can have more conversation about that in the future. In the last few minutes, if you got anything you want to put in the chat box about what you think the world would look like or what America would look like if there were no racism, please do so. And if there's any closing thoughts or comments, please share those in the chat box also. And I would ask our panelists if you would just take a minute or so and kind of summarize what you have experienced in this last hour and a half.
Well, I'll go first. I'll just say thank you. I have experienced a good deal here and learned a great deal from my colleagues here, and of course you, Deacon, and those great closing thoughts that you shared. It's affirmation for me, and some of the things that I experience, some of the feelings that I have. So I appreciate being able to have the conversation. And I also appreciate Macedonia Baptist Church for leading this conversation, because I really do believe that it's important for us to talk about these things and to be authentic, to develop trust, and to share our perspectives and learn from one another. So this has been very enriching for me. It's been very enlightening. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity for being here this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Craig?
Well, also I'd like to echo my thanks to you, Deacon Owens. I'm not used to calling you that, but it works. You walking it out, Doc. And also thanks to Macedonia for being willing to be salt and light in this area. I think for me, this has just been a conversation that, frankly, I've not really been able to engage in for the last several months. And it is refreshing, and it ignites something within me of the need to continue to engage in this work. You know, as David said, one of the most alarming things about Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is some of the things that he talked about in 1963, some, what are we, 50, 60 years later, are still present, are still an issue. And some of them have gotten worse. So the work still needs to be done. I'm so glad to have met my other two panelists. Dr. Sherry, make sure, please, I get your phone number, email address, and also you, David, before we leave here. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig. Sherry, if you would help close us out.
Sure. I just want to also echo what everyone else says. Thank you so much, Deacon Greg. You have no idea how much I admire and respect you and the work that you do. And so it is just, and also Macedonia, shout out to your church. I think because you all do such great work, you take it for granted, or you just assume that everybody else does what all that you all are doing. But I talk about your church all the time, about an example of what you can do and how you can have a tremendous impact in the community. Part of it is just by being willing to do the work and acknowledge that there's a problem in the first place. And then to do that work and to do it. So to have the history of doing the work you all have had is really refreshing. And also that you all of that church is standing in the gap. And that's important for other churches to see that because you can do it, they can do it too. And so I think I want to thank you all so much for that. I want to thank my colleagues for their insight and their words of wisdom. I do agree with you all. These talks are important to have. If nothing else, just so you know, it's good to fellowship with like-minded people because sometimes you get tired. And just to encourage everyone to take good care of themselves. Remember to put your mask on first and to take breaks when you need to. And I will share with you, one of the things I do is I play word games on my phone and I read romance novels. And I do that every day, regardless of what other work I have going on. I read a couple of chapters in a book and I play some word games just to relax. So please take care of yourselves.
Did I hear you say romance novels?
I sure do.
Okay. Okay. Okay, Pastor.
And proud of it too. That's
and
right.
proud of
I
it.
don't
She's
read anything
proud
about
of it.
psychology. I don't read anything about theology because I need what? A break from
A break.
that. I'm taking
That's
a break.
right. Step out of the frenzy and get into the flow.
Yeah.
Again, thank you all of you who have taken time from busy schedules and given us the treasure of your time. We appreciate it and we appreciate you. And I would leave you with this closing thought. If you're inclined to have this conversation, wherever you may be, and don't know how to get started, the website for healing that I shared with you earlier is a good source. But if you need to reach out to any of us, and particularly to me at Macedonia, because I continue to do this work even in retirement, I'm not a good model for retirement, and neither is Craig, and neither is Sherry, but the work is there to be done. So reach out and continue this conversation wherever you may be. It is 7:01. I value your time and I value you. Have a blessed evening. Thank you so much.